let's just get started with the warm-up and see how that went. Boom. All right, so again, we covered a lot. Majority of breakdown of your food into individual biomolecules. Most people got this, but not everybody. The jejunum is the main part where the lion's share of the breakdown as well as the absorption is happening. The ileum is more about reabsorbing the bile salts, and there's also a whole bunch of lymphatic tissue. That's where you find like the Peyer's patches and stuff, if you remember from anatomy, doing like immune stuff. But it's not so much about the breakdown and absorption of your nutrients. That's the jejunum. And again, the duodenum is just more of a very short, it's just like 10 inches long. It's where things are mixing together. It's where the chyme is getting delivered from the stomach. It's where the pancreatic juices are coming in. It's where the bile is coming in from the bile duct. So, name a hormone that stimulates the pancreas to deliver enzyme juice, as well as the gallbladder to deliver bile. That would be CCK, or cholecystokinin. Some of the other people got, name a hormone that stimulates the pancreas to produce bicarbonate juice. And that was secretin. What was the hormone that the endocrine cells in the gastric glands secrete to have the stomach secrete its acid and stuff?
Gastrin.
Gastrin, that was another one. And like I mentioned, we just gave you a few representative ones, hormones, in the interest of giving you a sense of it, but there's a lot more. If we were going to go into way more depth, there's a variety of other ones that are important as well. As well as other hormones that are involved with like satiety. Like that's a huge area of research, particularly because people are always worried about overeating or controlling their weight. So understanding all the signals that are at play in determining whether or not you feel full, whether you have the desire to eat or not. That's something people spend a lot of time researching, and there's a variety of hormones involved with that, the leptin and ghrelin and stuff like that. So continuing, name at least 2 different ways your body avoids digesting itself. Most people were getting this. We got like the mucus, which is just kind of just a physical thick barrier, that keeps the digestive juices and acids and enzymes from getting to the cells. And we talked about how the enzymes are produced in an inactive state, this proenzyme state, like the pepsinogen or trypsinogen or something, which doesn't activate until it is in the specialized pH of the lumen. And we also said that there's just a lot of cell turnover, right? Because if you minimally, even if you try to protect the cells, they don't have a very long life, and they end up getting ejected and recycled, and new cells come up from the crypts, so to speak, and replace the ones on the front line. When you swallow, food is peristalsis. Everybody got that. What was the other? If I want to, like for mixing stuff, it's smooshing, like digesting food with juices in my intestines. What is the other classic pattern of contraction?
Segmentation.
Segmentation, exactly. All right. This one, a lot of people kind of, this way you have to think when you're answering, like, because again, you're going to have your final exam in another week. So just reiterating before you move on to the next question, always kind of double check, is this what I want to do? So too little reabsorption of water in the colon. So if I am not absorbing enough water, that means the stuff that's leaving my body is watery. So I got diarrhea, right? Too much reabsorption of water in the colon. That means I've pulled a lot more water out. That means my feces is starting to get really hard and rock-like, and it's not gonna get pushed along very well, and I'm constipated. So we talked about the colon also has a lot of bacteria. Some of them are making some vitamins that are useful for you. Some of them are just breaking things down and making gas. So, la la. Are there any questions or points of clarification about the digestive system before we move along to the endocrine system? All right, so we're going to move along to the endocrine system. All right, so, hormones. We've been talking about hormones already now, and with respect to the nervous system, with adrenaline, with respect to the digestive system, with secretin and cholecystokinin and gastrin. These are just signaling molecules. But rather than being delivered at a specific target like a neurotransmitter would be, they are broadcast more generally. They're typically dumped into your bloodstream where they're just distributed everywhere. And then where do they have an effect? Where do they cause something to happen?
On a muscle or a gland, kind of all over the place. They're systemic.
How about more?
Whatever has the proper receptors.
Yeah, that's the answer I was looking for. So everyone hear Jeannie? Like any cell that has the proper receptor for that hormone is going to notice it and have some response. Right? So different hormones are going to have effects in different places depending on which cells have the appropriate receptors for those hormones. And I should also just mention, we are going to be talking about, can be, released by specialized glands, endocrine glands. Right, we're going to spend a lot of today talking about specialized endocrine glands like the pituitary and the adrenal and things like that. And also other organs. Right, it's not just specialized glands that release hormones. Like we talked about, the stomach, the small intestine release hormones, right? The heart releases hormones. If your atria are getting too stretched out, you'll release ANP, this hormone that actually lowers your blood pressure to try to bring your blood pressure back down because your heart's worried that things are getting too stretched out. So this idea of hormones is much more general than just the endocrine glands. While we're going to focus on the endocrine glands right now, remember that hormones are a more general way that one part of the body can talk to another part of the body. And there are also, things that are called paracrines. para meaning next to. So like a lot of times you have things release things that are kind of drifting and diffusing and communicating with a variety of cells nearby, but not quite in this broadcast of going into the bloodstream. So there's like a whole continuum. In general, I talk about this in anatomy. As humans, we really like to make sense of the world and put everything in categories and boxes and make it, I think we feel safer when we can like label everything and feel in control. But in reality, when you look at living systems, they're way messier than that. So there's going to be a whole continuum of types of signaling molecules in the body, from things that are released right at their target to things that are broadcast everywhere, that things are designed to just kind of diffuse in a local region and things like that. So, we're seeing kind of these kind of iconic types of signaling molecules, but there are also a continuum of signaling molecules that exist. Okay. In terms of types of hormones, we should kind of talk about the two main categories of hormones, which you've probably heard of, right? There's like steroid hormones. These are based on cholesterol. Therefore, they're lipids. The other class are the ones that are either based on amino acids, right? We've met adrenaline, epinephrine. We actually saw in like exam 1, at least half of you got that thing, like making epinephrine is just a couple of steps from tyrosine, which is an amino acid. So you can have things like epinephrine, which are just based on an amino acid, or a lot of hormones are just peptides, which are short chains of amino acids. Like, insulin, everybody's heard of insulin. It's just 37 amino acids connected together. That's what insulin is. A lot of the important hormones that we're going to talk about released by the hypothalamus to control the pituitary are literally just like, 8 or 9 or 10 amino acids long. But they do really important jobs. It depends. So obviously, things that are going to be steroids, since they're lipids, they are not going to be able to just go into the bloodstream like a polar molecule. So these are going to need carriers. So later on, when you're getting further on in your studies, like if you're talking about a steroid hormone like testosterone or estrogen or something, you talk both about bound hormone and free hormone. Like not all the hormone that is traveling around is actually free to actually act at their target, because a lot of it's going to be bound onto some plasma protein moving through the plasma, getting to where it's going. So, so people will talk about bound versus free hormone. Whereas amino acids and peptides can just dissolve in the plasma and move around. Other thing that's a big difference is where they tend to find their receptors. These guys that are these polar molecules, here's some cell. The receptors tend to be on the outside of the cell, kind of like what we've been talking about. So here's some hormone moving along. There's some receptor for the hormone. on the outside of the cell is going to trigger usually some second messenger pathway to do signal transduction and have something happen in the cell. Steroid hormones, on the other hand, because they're lipids, what do we know about lipids and cell membranes?
They can cross easily.
They can cross. So if I have a steroid hormone, here's my cell. Steroid hormone, it's going to need some kind of carrier to get up to the cell, but once it's at the cell, it just moves across the membrane. Not only that, it moves across the nuclear envelope. So the receptors are often in the nucleus. They're weird. They're not like the receptor. The receptors that we've been talking about when I was showing you the classic, like when I showed you the serotonin receptor, that's a pretty classic receptor. These nuclear receptors are way different. They're usually multi-parts that disassemble and reassemble. So it's a whole different beast that we're not going to get into. But they are basically receptors that recognize the hormone and cause activities to happen in the cell upon binding the hormone. Typically, it's going to be more dealing with, turning on and off protein synthesis or controlling cell activities. The nucleus is more kind of the control center of a cell. Another difference between steroid hormones and these peptide or amino acid based hormones is just half-lives. These tend to have longer half-life compared. So what I should, if you haven't been introduced to the idea of half-life, you should know half-life. So the idea of half-life, when you release something into the body, or you take something exogenously, some drug or whatever, it starts getting broken down, usually by enzymes from the liver. Oh, fuck, I have to talk about the liver. I forgot the liver. So like your liver, one of your liver's jobs is it's got all these different specialized enzymes for breaking things down and deactivating things. But it's not a linear process. We have this idea of a half-life is how long does it take for half of whatever is flowing around in your bloodstream to get broken down. So let's say at time equals 0, you've got this much of, let's say, a hormone released, adrenaline released into your bloodstream, or cortisol, or whatever, or caffeine that you've just taken in your coffee, whatever. You've just put in something into your body. At one half-life, let's say T is my half-life, I will have broken down half of it. If I wait for another half-life, I will have broken down half of what's left. If I wait for another half-life, I will have broken down half of what's left of that. If I wait for another half-life, I will have broken down half of what's left of that. So it's this exponential decay, right? It doesn't just go away linearly. It's, so whether you're looking at drugs or hormones or whatever, the clearance in your body is happening in this kind of exponential decay. The half-life of something like adrenaline is minutes. So within minutes, half of the adrenaline that got dumped in your bloodstream is gone. Within a few more minutes, you were down to like 3/4, a majority of it's gone. With steroid hormones, the half-life's more on the order of an hour and a half for a couple of hours or something. So the levels, once things are released, they stay up in your body for much longer and they don't decay as much. This idea of half-life will come back, like when you do your pharmacology and stuff, will be a really, you've probably seen it already. If you just look at the specifications for any kind of drug, they talk about its half-life, which is telling you like how long it stays in the body and how quickly it's cleared out. So, So hormones are going to be either these peptide or amino acid based, which bind on the cell membranes outside, tend to have short lives, have an easy time moving through the bloodstream, or they can be steroids, which are going to need specialized carriers to move around. They also typically are just kind of made as you need them. Like the other kinds of hormones you can kind of make ahead of time and then store and release. But, the steroid hormones you kind of make as you need them and release. But once they're released, they tend to stay doing their job for a lot longer than the other kinds of hormones. And also, like I mentioned, they usually have receptors in the nucleus of the cells rather than on the outside of the cells. So that is that. Let's talk about control of hormone release. What actually will trigger the release of some hormone? And we've already seen it. What kind of things trigger the release of like secretin or CCK or something like that?
Environmental changes like pH.
Yeah, exactly. Right, environmental conditions. Right, if your pH is too low, you release secretin. If there are fats present, you release CCK. If there is a lot of glucose showing up in your blood, you release insulin. If there is going to be, what else? Too low calcium, you're going to release parathyroid hormone. There's a variety of hormones that are triggered just by the conditions within your body. So environmental conditions. Another one we saw was when we looked at the sympathetic nervous system. What's another way you can trigger the release of a hormone? What triggered the release of epinephrine?
Some kind of external stimuli that freaked you out, basically.
Well, that was just the stimulus. What was the actual thing that caused the response? It's just the nervous system. Now you can have the nervous system just trigger the release of hormones. I mean, John, you're right. Like there were some conditions that the nervous system was processing to decide to do it. But ultimately, the nervous system pushed the button on the adrenal gland to release the hormone, the adrenaline. So environmental conditions, nervous system. But there's one other one that's actually probably the most common. And that is going to be just other hormones. And hormones that control the release of yet other hormones we call tropic hormones. We are going to see sometimes there are multiple levels, like your hypothalamus is going to release corticotropic releasing hormone, which causes the pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which causes the adrenal gland to release cortisol, right? So you can be actually multiple levels of hormones, releasing other hormones. And then we'll see there's feedback too, where hormones can actually inhibit the release of other hormones in order to, maintain homeostatic levels of hormones in your body. So we're going to see a lot of these tropic hormones. They're going to be at the core of the reproductive system. When we get to the reproductive system in more detail on Thursday, the whole ovarian and menstrual cycle in the woman, the month, from the beginning of the month to the end of the month, it's all about tropic hormones, triggering the release of other hormones and modulating things. So we'll see a lot of this. So environmental, again, insulin is just going to be looking at sugar levels in your blood. Your pancreas, I should say, is looking for sugar levels in your blood and deciding whether to release insulin. Your adrenal medulla is just waiting for the electrical signals coming from the sympathetic nervous system in order to release adrenaline. But a lot of your other hormones are being released or being controlled by specialized tropic hormones, which we're going to meet a bunch of right now. Okie dokie. But I wonder if hold on. Where'd it go? Where's the, your book, I will say, I like Silverthorne's, here, I'm gonna show you this picture here. Slideshow, slide. And I like that Silver, Die Unglaub, is trying to really kind of show how lots of things are interconnected, but she also, I think, makes things confusing when you're first learning stuff. So the endocrine system is split across 2 chapters in the beginning and the end of your book. So as you're studying this stuff, you're going to have to look in both chapters and, and put them together. But this is from chapter 7 in the beginning of the book. This is kind of showing a lot of these things that are kind of primarily endocrine glands. Like I said, endocrine gland or endocrine function can happen in lots of organs, right? Your small intestine is an endocrine gland, endocrine organ. It's releasing hormones. Your heart releases hormones. But these glands here in this chart here from chapter 7, these are things whose primary raison d'etre is to release hormones into the body. The pineal gland, which we've already talked about, releasing melatonin. So we're not going to cover that one again. The hypothalamus, we've introduced in the nervous system as this thing that controls the pituitary gland. We're going to look at that in more detail right now. The pituitary gland itself, let me maybe get a little annotator thing here. Oh, where is it? Draw. So the pituitary, which is kind of sitting right here underneath your hypothalamus in your head, often thought of as the master gland, because it actually releases a lot of these tropic hormones, these hormones that control other glands. So the pituitary gland is going to do things that actually control your thyroid gland, that control your adrenal cortex, that control your gonads, which are also, in addition to making gametes, eggs and sperm, are also important endocrine glands making the sex hormones. So the hypothalamus is going to control the pituitary. The pituitary is going to control these other ones. So we're going to be seeing all of that as we go on. We'll also talk about parathyroid. Thymus, I am not going to talk much more about. We've mentioned that the thymus is the place where T cells mature. It has specialized hormones that help with that process of the maturing of T lymphocytes. Also, again, kind of culling the herd, making sure we don't release any lymphocytes that have receptors that are going to recognize your own cells. But beyond that, we're not going to talk about the thymus gland because we don't have time. So we're going to focus on, the gonads. We're going to focus on the hypothalamus and the pituitary. We're going to focus on the thyroid, parathyroid, and we're going to focus on the pancreas. And the gonads are also going to be our segue into reproductive, because understanding these hormones that are both released by the pituitary to control the gonads and the hormones themselves that are released by the gonads are going to be key in understanding the processes of creating the gametes and getting them together and creating a place for the little embryo to develop into a new little human being. So, okie dokie. But again, when you're using your book, realize that the endocrine system is split across 2 chapters. So you'll have to look at 2 chapters to really see the whole picture. And they're not even next to each other. They're like on opposite sides of the book. One chapter is in the beginning of the book. The other chapter is near the end of the book. And speaking of the book, I sent you out a thing. I think the library sent a thing out as well. So please, make sure you do return those books, because otherwise the next semester people won't have the opportunity you had to have free books. So please do return those. Okay. So we're going to look in more detail at the hypothalamus and the pituitary right now. So the hypothalamus from the brain. Again, remember the hypothalamus did all sorts of stuff. It was in your emotions, it was drives, temperature, it's where you set your temperature, hunger, thirst, and lots of your kind of autonomic functioning, heart and breathing and this and that. But it's also a key player in controlling your endocrine system. And it does that via controlling the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland, if you've been in anatomy, it's also called the hypophysis. I should put it in quotes. It's also called the hypophysis. The pituitary gland has 2 main sections. There's this rear section, which is going to be called the neurohypophysis. Or just posterior pituitary. And then the kind of front part, which is the adenohypophysis. Or anterior. It's worth talking a little bit about just how this is put together. They're actually derived from different kinds of tissues embryonically. The neurohypophysis, as its name implies, is derived from neural tissue. It's actually the cells in the hypothalamus that are making the hormones. There's neurons here that send their axons down. And actually, the hormones that are released by the neurohypophysis are actually made by the neurons in the hypothalamus and just kind of delivered via the posterior pituitary. In the neurohypophysis, this is where we're going to find ADH, which you all already know. I don't have to introduce, it needs no introduction. What does ADH do?
It's the antidiuretic hormone, so it inhibits or it doesn't inhibit. It helps like flush out of your system, right?
And how does it do that? Where is the target for antidiuretic hormone?
Isn't that the one that
Urinary.
aquapores in the kidney?
Yeah, what particular part of the kidney?
The aquapores in the collecting duct?
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing that is going to insert aquaporins in the collecting duct, which is then going to cause more water to get pulled back into the body as the filtrate goes down through that super salty medulla. And so antidiuretic, so it's not going to wash out your system. It's going to actually keep the water in your body, right? We saw it first in the renin-angiotensin mechanism. We were talking about control of blood pressure. It's keeping your blood volume up by retaining water. What else does it do?
Doesn't it stimulate the thirst center?
Yeah, it stimulated thirst. And then what other big job did it have?
It's a vasoconstrictor.
Vasoconstrictor. Remember, its other name was vasopressin. Right, so ADH should ring all sorts of bells. It's and it's at the core of kidney function, which is a major thing on your upcoming exam. So make sure ADH is something that you feel comfortable with. The other thing made by these neurons but released by the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. Oxytocin is a fascinating hormone. It's implicated in all sorts of bonding and nurturing behaviors. I should say social bonding. It's like after orgasm, it's released as part of that kind of warm, fuzzy feeling and feeling kind of connected and close. Oxytocin release is implicated in, I think I mentioned, in the efficacy of MDMA in therapeutic contexts. MDMA, ecstasy, helps release oxytocin, which makes people feel kind of more safer and nurtured and connected. And it's easier to kind of go into stuff. Oxytocin is also important for delivering children. This is what causes the uterine contractions. Like when somebody is starting to go into labor, more and more oxytocin is being released, which causes stronger uterine contractions, which causes even more oxytocin, which makes even stronger uterine contractions. It's one of the few examples of positive feedback loop in the body. Obviously ends when the baby's finally delivered. So oxytocin, sometimes people call it like a cuddle hormone or love drug or something, because it tends to be, again, connected with these kinds of feelings and behaviors. And it's not just in humans. They have showed that a dog and its owner have mutual oxytocin release when they gaze into each other's eyes. They have showed that oxytocin is even part of like mice. Mice take care of each other. One of the things that's kind of disturbing when you look at kind of details of animal studies, like sometimes one of the problematic things of like hooking up a mouse into something to kind of test something is that the other mice are going to come in and try to help it out. So if it's trapped or something, it's like, this kind of, so it's not just humans that are kind of about social bonding and trying to take care of each other. It's like lots of other creatures seem to do that. So ADH, oxytocin.
Quick question.
Sure.
Do you know if this happens with cats as well?
So cats are, it's threatening to like stare. So the idea of staring at, in fact, if the whole cat I love you thing is to like slowly shut your eyes and let them know that I am not challenging you and staring you down. So with a cat, you're not actually telling them that you are their pal if you're like staring at them in general. So that's the whole thing with cats. Cats bond. There've been some really fascinating studies where they've shown that like cats are really good at problem solving and things like that, and people didn't realize it just because it was harder to motivate the cats to like show you what they could do, because they're like, why should I do that? But they do like attention. They do like, so I don't know if people have studied the oxytocin release in cats as much, but it's not going to be from mutual gaze, I don't think, because in general, mutual gaze is threatening. It's not like an expression of adoration like it would be in a dog or a human. So anterior pituitary, but yeah, cats definitely are very much, especially at least with humans, do care a lot about that bonding and will perform in order to feel they're getting that attention. Okay, anterior pituitary. This is more classic glandular material. And this is controlled by hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. So let me give myself more room here to draw. So So the hypothalamus has these hormones they're called releasing hormones. There's a variety of them. The only one you need to know by name, because it's going to be a key player in the control of the reproductive system, is gonadotropin releasing hormone. So I'm going to just put its name on here right now. But there's lots of others. There's thyrotropin releasing hormone and corticotropic releasing hormone, lots of different of these quote unquote releasing hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. And then they talk to the pituitary gland cells and the anterior pituitary, which are then going to release a variety of hormones in response to those releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. I don't really have it. I'll just mention super briefly because it's cool. We talked about portal systems. What's a portal system?
Where you have blood going from one capillary system to another without returning to the heart.
Exactly. So here's the site of yet another portal system. We talked about hepatic portal system. We saw the portal system in the nephron from the glomerulus to the peritubular capillaries. There's also the hypophyseal, right? Hypophyseal portal system, where you have capillaries in the hypothalamus, which pick up the releasing hormones and then deliver them directly into capillaries in the pituitary gland. So we've got this nice, quick and direct delivery of the hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Again, it's called the hypophyseal portal system. Capillary bed 1 in the hypothalamus, capillary bed 2 in the anterior pituitary. So you don't gotta wait till it goes all the way through circulation to find its way to the pituitary. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is talk about the hormones released by the anterior pituitary. All right, so we said posterior, posterior was oxytocin, ADH. We're going to do the anterior pituitary. So some of the important ones from the anterior pituitary are tropic hormones, hormones that control other glands. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. From its name, you can probably guess it controls the thyroid gland. We'll talk about this more when we get to the thyroid gland. So this is hormones released by the anterior pituitary. And again, the control of thyroid stimulating hormone is going to be some releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. Right, the hypothalamus is going to release actually this thyrotropic releasing hormone, which then is going to cause these cells to release the thyroid stimulating hormone.
And that's only for the anterior, right? With the
Right.
releasing hormones?
Yes. The oxytocin and ADH are actually made by cells in the hypothalamus and just kind of delivered to the posterior pituitary. So thyroid stimulating hormone. Another one is ACTH. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, from its name, adrenocortico, this basically controls the adrenal cortex release. Like the medulla, the inner part of the adrenal gland is the thing that makes adrenaline, but the outer part, the cortex of the adrenal gland, makes a bunch of steroid hormones. Again, you've met one of them already. Aldosterone comes from the adrenal cortex, but cortisol, your main stress hormone, which we'll talk about, comes here. People often talk about the kind of hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, because these, hypothalamus controls the pituitary, pituitary controls the adrenal gland. And this is one of the big things involved with your stress response, right? The hypothalamus is more kind of psychic, right? What you're thinking, man, I'm stressed. I've got finals coming up and I'm trying to get into nursing school and whatever, which is going to cause the hypothalamus to pull the strings on the pituitary, but with its releasing hormones, which are going to cause a release of ACTH, but which is then going to go to the adrenal gland and cause a release of cortisol into your body. So people often, kind of often when people talk about the endocrine system, they often will talk about like neuroendocrine system, because it's like your nervous system and your endocrine system are so inextricably entwined, because your nervous system, hypothalamus, is pulling the strings on the pituitary, but the pituitary has all these tropic hormones, which are controlling your other major glands. So it's, saying endocrine system as its independent thing is ridiculous, right? It's kind of this really entangled thing. Another tropic hormone, or actually a pair of tropic hormones released by the pituitary, are the gonadotropins. There's two of them. There's LH and FSH. So this So again, this is going to be a major theme when we get to the reproductive system in more detail. But basically, hypothalamus is releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then tells the pituitary gland to release these gonadotropins, which we'll look at in more detail in just a moment. And then these, talk to the gonads. Talk to control hormone release by the gonads and more, as well, as we'll see. Again, the gonads would be the testes if you're a dude and the ovaries if you're a woman. So let's look at LH and FSH in a little more detail right now, since we need to know them in more detail anyway as we get further into the reproductive system. So LH, luteinizing hormone. Obviously, these are going to do different things if they are in a man or in a woman. So in a woman, luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation. So this is going to be released once the egg matures and is ready to go. There's going to be a spike of luteinizing hormone that's going to trigger ovulation. Also, so it gets its name luteinizing hormone because after ovulation happens, the egg pops out, but this remaining cells, we're going to talk about follicle in a few moments. The remaining cells convert into this thing called the corpus luteum. It's called that because it's kind of yellowish. Luteum comes from Latin for yellow. And that corpus luteum is going to make progesterone. And progesterone basically preserves the uterine lining. Right, so if you've just ovulated an egg, that means there's a potential pregnancy that's going to happen if this thing gets fertilized, which means you want to make sure the uterus is ready to receive it, which this progesterone is saying, we just ovulated an egg. There's a potential pregnancy. Make sure you hold on to the lining here in case this thing comes down the line and needs to implant and start developing. When we get to the cycle, the monthly cycle in more detail, we'll see that when progesterone drops, if there's no pregnancy, that's what's going to be the trigger for menses, the menstrual flow, as the uterine lining sloughs off. So that's luteinizing hormone. This is if we're in a female. In a male, obviously, it's going to have to be different. For a dude, it is going to trigger cells to produce testosterone. Or I should say stimulates testosterone production. So when we get to the testes in more detail on Thursday, you'll see there's these cells called interstitial cells that make testosterone. And when they get this message LH, they make more testosterone. In fact, sometimes if you're just looking in a guy, instead of calling it LH, you can call it interstitial cell stimulating hormone. ICSH is the same thing as LH. It's just in the context of a guy, it makes more sense to call it ICSH. But you can still call it LH. So that's the first gonadotropin, LH. The other gonadotropin is FSH that we need to talk about.
So that's all that luteinizing hormone does in males is stimulates testosterone production.
Yeah, mainly. The guy is way simpler in general than the woman because all the guy needs to do is make gametes and control some sex hormone levels, whereas the woman has this whole other role of providing a place for the developing embryo to grow and all that. So yeah, things are going to be way, way simpler in the guy. Follicle stimulating hormone. So this will make sense if you know what a follicle is. So in an ovary, when a woman is born, she basically has all these oocytes that have already committed into meiosis that are just kind of stalled out, right? It's always, I mean, it's part of that ticking clock thing of like, you know, of a woman, all the eggs she's got and all the things that she's going to ovulate, they've actually started dividing already before she was born and are kind of suspended and then continue developing at the beginning of the month. Well, certain ones do. So here we have these little kind of stalled out oocytes. egg cells. The egg cells are never on their own. Again, we're going to look at gametes in more detail when we do the reproductive system. But like in a guy, you got the sperm. It's just basically, it's a single cell, some little chromosome delivery system. The egg, first, the egg is way bigger. Is never on its own. There's always these other cells around it. Even after it's ovulated, you have these granulosa cells making up the corona radiata. And we're going to talk about this in more detail, but just for right now, for this idea of the follicle, the egg and all of its associated cells are what we call the follicle, which goes through different levels of development. So primordial follicles, when you're born, there's a few little cells, and as the monthly cycle starts, some of these stalled oocytes will start growing and the cells around them will get more complicated. By the time you're ready to ovulate, you've got this whole big thing called the tertiary or Graafian follicle. The egg is kind of getting ready to get popped out. There's other cells left over that are going to become the corpus luteum. So we have this idea of primordial follicles, first order follicles. Again, I'm going to talk about this more later. Secondary follicles, the Graafian follicle, which is then going to ovulate and get the egg out into the body. So you can get a sense, follicle stimulating hormone is what is stimulating this process. Under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, some of these primordial follicles that have been waiting since the moment you were born are going to start this process. It takes about 2 weeks to become this mature Graafian follicle ready to ovulate. The follicle also produces estrogen. So in addition to having a place where the egg is maturing, getting ready to get ovulated, the follicle itself is producing estrogen, which is helping prepare the, helps prepare the uterus. So we're going to look at this in way more detail next class. But basically, in the beginning of your cycle, if you're a woman, FSH is going up. FSH is causing some of these eggs to mature into these Graafian follicles. One of them ultimately makes it all the way. That follicle is also making estrogen. That estrogen is talking to the uterus and telling the uterine lining to get ready for a potential pregnancy. At the end of the 2 weeks, when the egg is ready to ovulate, the uterus is also fully ready to receive something, right? And then that's when you're going to get luteinizing hormone, which is going to trigger the ovulation and also create this corpus luteum to make progesterone and tell the uterus, hold on, we've got a potential pregnancy coming. And again, what controls the release of LH and FSH?
Gonadotropin releasing hormone from the
Exactly,
the
gonadotropin
hypothalamus.
releasing hormone, right? So, and it's going to be very different in a guy and in a woman. In a guy, you just have little pulses of gonadotropin releasing hormone released constantly every few hours. So they're constantly making testosterone, they're constantly making sperm. Whereas in a woman, there's a much more kind of complicated month-long cycle of different things going up and down, interlocking, that we're going to look at in detail on Thursday. So we'll come back to this in much more detail, but it makes sense to just talk about it in detail right now, at least. So when you see it on Thursday, you've got a sense of what's going on, and it'll feel more familiar and comfortable rather than just more stuff all coming at you. All righty then. So anterior pituitary. Thyroid stimulating hormones, a tropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormones, a tropic hormone controlling your adrenal cortex. The gonadotropins, including LH and FSH, are tropic hormones that are talking to your gonads. Oh, I should, for completeness, I forgot to talk about FSH. Whoops. FSH, this is obviously in the female. How about in a guy? What do you think FSH does?
Promotes the maturation of sperm cells.
Yeah, exactly. Promotes sperm production. So again, it's like I said, things in the guy are going to be a little more simple. Okay. Right? These are the tropic hormones that are coming from the anterior pituitary. There are other important hormones that are coming from here as well that are not tropic. One is growth hormone. Growth hormone, GH. This is necessary for normal kind of tissue maintenance and growth. It's actually, if you don't have enough of it, your tissues don't stay maintained. If you have too much, though, things actually get weird. In fact, this is a good place to talk about a lot of the pathologies that happen with the endocrine system. Like most pathologies associated with the endocrine system are because you have either hyposecretion, not enough secretion of some hormone, or hypersecretion. So for instance, if you have hyposecretion of growth hormone while you are still growing, when you're still like an adolescent, everything doesn't grow, things don't grow enough. You end up becoming really small. You get what's called like pituitary dwarfism. It's different than like a dwarf, like, you know, what's that dude from like the Game of Thrones, like what's his name? Tyro? Somebody, what, you know that dude?
I was thinking of Peter Dinklage, but
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Tyrone Lannister.
Yeah, exactly. Like there, like the body proportions are different than kind of your typical body proportions. So that's a different kind of dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism, all the body proportions are kind of typical, but the person's just really small. That would be from hyposecretion of growth hormone when you're growing, when you're going through growth. Hypersecretion, you can get pituitary gigantism, where somebody goes so big and so tall that they can't even support their own weight. So it can be really problematic, because if somebody gets too large, you know, their musculoskeletal system can't handle the size and the weight. So either one is an issue. If you get hypersecretion as an adult, it's a little different because like once you have, epiphyseal plates are closed, if you remember, again, from anatomy, we're not going into it in this class, but lengthening of bones happen at these epiphyseal plates that are only active up to kind of your late teens, early 20s. So if you get too much growth hormone after the bones can no longer elongate, you can still have the flat bones getting fatter and like your face can get all kind of weird. People who take growth hormone as a performance enhancing thing, people do take this, like athletes will take it because it's anabolic. It'll make your muscles bigger and stronger, but it'll also make you look weird as your face starts widening out and stuff like that. Again, because there's kind of a sweet spot. You need enough to kind of maintain and keep things going, but you don't want too much. So growth hormone, prolactin is kind of what it sounds like, promotes lactation. This is, so like the mammary glands are normally going to be in this kind of suspended state. They're not typically going to be active, except if a woman is pregnant and getting ready to have a baby, then you're going to need to turn on those glands. Prolactin turns on the mammary glands, but it doesn't actually cause them to like eject the milk. Oxytocin, among its other things, this is responsible for what we call milk letdown, which means having the mammary glands actually squirt the milk out. So oxytocin is what makes the mammary glands squirt the milk out, but the prolactin is what's kind of getting the glands activated in the first place, getting them ready to produce the milk. Milk, which is just kind of a modified form of sweat, right? Mammary glands are just specialized apocrine sweat glands. Right, and because oxytocin is also involved with uterine contractions by nursing, the same hormone that's causing the mammary glands to squirt out the milk is also sending a message to the uterus to contract and try to kind of get back into shape after it's just been stretched out like crazy after having a baby, stretch it all the way out. So a lot of times women, when they're nursing, can even feel their uterus kind of, as the same hormone that causes the milk letdown also triggers the uterus to start pulling back in. Oxytocin is also what people get if you want to induce contraction, induce labor. Tocin is, I think, I forget how they spell it, but they'll give somebody exogenous oxytocin if you want to induce labor. Right? Normally, you wait for it to happen on its own, but if it's not happening fast enough and you want it to happen, you can actually trigger it by giving a woman oxytocin.
Or Pitocin.
Right. So it's the same thing. Yeah.
Well, isn't Pitocin the one that triggers the oxytocin? Because you can't really give oxytocin, right? You have to give Pitocin, because I've had it twice during pregnancies. So
yeah, so actually I'm not exactly totally sure of the mechanism, so I'd have to look into that. So it could be that. Yeah, I don't know. So prolactin, growth hormone. So I think that's going to be the pituitary. Let me double check. I did not miss anything on this little pituitary. Okay. So I spent a lot of time on the pituitary because, again, it's kind of this master gland, right? And it also has these major players. But we do need to look at the other glands, which we will do, kind of, but pretty quickly, right? So in terms of like for your exam, we're gonna talk about the thyroid. We're gonna talk about the pancreas. We're going to talk about the adrenal. You should know the main hormones that are produced at these glands and their functions, which I'm going to go over now. The other glands, we're going to talk about the gonads in more detail next class. Like I said, pineal, we've already gone over. Thymus, we've already talked about as all we're going to talk about. So the glands that we need to talk about, and parathyroid, I should say. So for the purposes of our class, for each of these glands, I'm just going to briefly talk about what hormones are released by them and what those hormones do, and maybe a little background that'll be interesting. So let's do that. We can start with the thyroid, the parathyroid. Yeah, maybe look at the time. Yeah, let's do the thyroid and the parathyroid. We'll take a little break since I assume people start glazing over after an hour and a half. Then we'll finish up with the pancreas and the adrenal, and then we'll get into our lab. And the good thing is by going, spending the time we did with the gonadotropins, that's going to really give us a good foundation for doing the reproductive system on Thursday. So let's just do thyroid and parathyroid. All right, so you've got your breathing, you've got your trachea, which is your windpipe. You've got your larynx. Which is, that voice box, oh, it's where your vocal cords are. What's sitting at the top of the larynx that keeps you from having food go down into your lungs?
Epiglottis.
Little epiglottis is right above there. That's not, your larynx is the top of the trachea. I'm being a spazozoid here. Trachea. So sitting right below the larynx, kind of sitting around the trachea, like a little bow tie, is the thyroid gland. It releases two main kinds of hormones. There's something often is called thyroxine, which is actually T3 and T4. I'm going to give you the names, the official names of these, but because I want you to see the important element that's in them. This is triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine. Tetra just means 4, tri is 3. The main point I want you to take home here is they need iodine. They're both made with iodine. Thyroxine, this thyroid hormone, is made with iodine. If you don't have enough iodine, you can't make thyroid hormone. What does thyroid hormone do? And again, these two things get interconverted between each other. Don't worry about one versus the other. It's kind of a family. What does thyroid hormone do, though?
It helps bone growth.
Not so much, no. It controls your metabolic rate.
That's what I meant.
So it's going to kind of speed up or slow down energy production and the speed of your metabolic pathways and stuff like that. People who are hyperthyroid are just, things get really fast and twitchy. They get really gaunt and thin because they're burning a lot of fuel. One of my colleagues knew he had hyperthyroidism because he would start writing the next word on the board after, before he finished writing the sentence he was in, because his brain and his body was off onto the next thing before he'd finished what he was at. People who are hypothyroid, don't have enough thyroid hormone, get sluggish and tired and more kind of like gaining weight. There's kind of a sweet spot of enough of it, but not too much. You don't want to it's kind of like throttling your engine. You want to find the idle of your engine where it's going well and it's ready to go and do what it needs to do. If it's too slow, it's bloop, 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 it's going to die. If it's too fast, you're burning things out. So thyroxine or thyroid hormone has to be kind of at the level where it's, your metabolic rate is having all your body's needs met, but it's not running too fast or too slow. If you don't have enough iodine, you can't make it. Again, what tropic hormone is controlling the thyroid gland?
TSH.
Mm-hmm. So this is going to be an example of this kind of feedback loop that is very common in hormone production and regulation. So TSH from the pituitary is coming and telling the thyroid gland, release thyroxine. But then thyroxine is going to go back and put the brakes on the TSH. Because if we have enough thyroxine, we can tell the pituitary, we got enough, slow down, we take your foot off the gas. If the thyroxine starts dropping, then we stop this inhibition, the thyroid stimulating hormone will go up again, and we're gonna tell the thyroid gland we need to beef up production. Right, so this is this kind of negative feedback loop, right? When thyroxine gets high, thyroid stimulating hormone goes down, but when thyroxine drops, the thyroid stimulating hormone goes back up, which is going to increase the production of thyroxine again. Does that make sense? What happens if you don't have enough iodine? This is called goiter. What is the pituitary? What's the thyroid gland? What's going to happen at the thyroid gland if there's not enough iodine?
Swells.
But why?
Like a backlog of gross goobers.
No. No, so it's more about, so again, to make thyroxine, you need iodine. So if you don't have iodine, what's happening to our thyroxine level here?
It's
Dropping.
too low.
You're not going to make it, right? It's like, what's going to happen to, so if there's not the iodine, you can't make the thyroxine. So there's not a lot of thyroxine. The thyroid gland's trying, but it doesn't have the raw materials. So that means thyroid stimulating hormone is going to go up, which steps on the gas. Thyroid gland actually starts increasing tissue size. It makes more cells that can make thyroxine, because thyroid stimulating hormone is saying we need more thyroxine. But the thyroid gland is trying, but more cells isn't going to help because we don't have the iodine. So the pituitary gland says, but we need more thyroxine, grow, and it grows, but we're still not getting thyroxine because we don't got the raw materials. So you're getting this swollen thyroid gland. You can actually see it start swelling up there at the base of the throat there. If you don't have enough iodine. Does that make sense? If somebody, so the other things, it's actually, other things it's worth talking about, because the thyroid gland uses iodine to make its hormones. It concentrates iodines like 200 times rest of the body. And this is one of the reasons why, like, when some nuclear reactor sends off radioactive iodine into the air, people get worried, because if you breathe in if you get radioactive iodine in your body, it's going to concentrate in your thyroid gland and it can damage the cells. But this is actually used practically, right? If you are hyperthyroid and you need to kill off thyroid cells, you could surgically do it, or you can give somebody radioactive iodine, which will concentrate right here and just kill off the cells here mainly. And it has a pretty short half-life, only like a couple of weeks, so it goes away pretty quick. So it's a non-surgical way of taking out somebody's thyroid gland, is by giving them radioactive iodine. Obviously, then for the rest of their life, you're going to have to give them synthetic thyroid hormone. They call it like Synthroid, to keep your thyroid gland, your thyroxine levels at the appropriate level, to keep your metabolic rate adjusted. So that's the thyroid gland, controls metabolic rate. Thyroid hormone needs iodine, which has a number of implications, both in terms of disease if you don't have enough iodine, in terms of how you can kill off an iodine. Another way to get a hypothyroid is autoimmune. There's Hashimoto's syndrome, is not uncommon at all. I know 2 people who have it, where your own immune system cells attack your thyroid gland and then will cause hyposecretion of thyroid hormone, and then you just have to take Synthroid for the rest of your life.
There's also Graves too, right? Which is the overproduction.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and that one actually gets, and that's also, I'm not sure why it happens, but that causes exophthalmosis, like the bug eyes, like the Marty Feldman eyes. So when people are hyperthyroid, their eyes tend to bulge out, and they get this kind of crazy looking bulgy eye look to them. I shouldn't say crazy looking, this distinctive bulgy eyes. So the thyroid gland also makes one other hormone that's doesn't seem all that physiologically relevant, but I'll put it in here. So it also produces this thing called calcitonin, which seems to be important in like storing calcium. However, when people really look at it, it doesn't seem all that crazy important. We're going to have a sister hormone, which is going to be released from the parathyroids, which is going to be really important. So in general, you have all the calcium you're ever going to need for the rest of your life already stored away in your bones. So there's another hormone that is monitoring calcium levels and is going to help release calcium if your calcium levels are dropping. So the thyroid gland we've just been talking about, there's on a new page, here we go. Okay, I got it. So thyroid gland, there's another gland that is actually not the thyroid gland. It's got its own personality, but it happens to exist as little islands of tissue on the back of the thyroid gland. And they call them the parathyroid glands. Again, they're not the thyroid gland. They're not part of it. They just happen to be, it's like a remora fish is not a shark, right? A remora fish is just a little fish that's suckered onto a shark. The parathyroid glands are like the remora fish on the thyroid gland there. They just live there, located there. These make this parathyroid hormone. Released if calcium is low. So if your calcium levels in your body are low, parathyroid hormone is released. Where do you think the target is for parathyroid hormone? If your body needs calcium, where's it going to get it from?
Your bones?
From your bones. So this is going to be, does anybody remember from anatomy, what are the special cells in bones that actually dissolve the bone matrix and release the calcium?
The osteoclasts?
Exactly. So this is going to be talking to the osteoclast saying we need a little more calcium, so dissolve a little bone and free it up so we can bring the calcium levels back up. So that is the way people found this existed was pretty sad. It's like there were people that were hyperthyroid. So they're like, oh, if they're hyperthyroid, we need to just reduce the amount of thyroid tissue. So they went in and they cut out a bunch of the thyroid tissue, which helped with the hyperthyroidism, but caused these horrible mineral imbalances because they also took out, they realized, what the heck did we just do here? And realized, oh my God, we caused us collateral damage we didn't realize by taking out this other gland here that's super important that happened to be in that same location of the tissue that we all cut out. So parathyroid glands are super important, and they are the ones that are maintaining your calcium levels in general. There's just two more glands that we need to cover, and one of them we've already basically covered in lots of ways already. One of the pancreas. Pancreas we've seen in two contexts now, right? We saw the pancreas has two different kinds of glandular function. It can act as what we call an exocrine gland. Exocrine means delivers secretions via ducts. like your lacrimal glands and your tear ducts, or your, sweat glands and that deliver sweat to your skin through little tubes, or your salivary glands deliver saliva into your mouth through little tubes. The pancreas, we saw, delivers enzyme juice and bicarbonate juice into the small intestine via little tubes. So it has exocrine function, but it's also an endocrine gland, which is, the ductless glands, where it just makes some stuff which then goes into the bloodstream to get where it's going to go. So it's like a classic, as you go on through life, if you ever get some question on something saying, well, what's the gland that has both endocrine and exocrine function? It's like, me, pancreas, call on me. So we've already looked at this. We've alluded to the endocrine function when we're talking about insulin. These are separate cells from the cells that make the digestive juices, made in, we call the pancreatic islets of Langerhans. I should say hormones are made. Again, these are going to make insulin. Its sister hormone called glucagon. So insulin, we've already talked about. Insulin is released when glucose levels rise in your bloodstream. And it's basically going to tell your cells, take up that glucose. It tells regular cells, just take it up for whatever metabolic needs you have. Specifically in the liver, it tells the liver, store it away, make glycogen that we can then use as a storage carbohydrate for later in case our glucose levels are low. So insulin released if your glucose levels are high and tells your cells to take it up and use it. Glucagon is the opposite. Released if your glucose is low. So like your blood sugar is dropping. Glucagon gets released, and it is going to, like, one of the big things it does is it turns on the enzymes, the amylases, so to speak, that break apart the glycogen stored in your liver to release that sugar back into your body. So like your liver's been storing carbohydrates, glucagon is the thing that turns on the enzymes that will free up that glucose and back into the body. I have here, my gosh, one molecule. One molecule of glucagon can stimulate the release of 100 million molecules of glucose. Right, so they're kind of sister things. Insulin, if you've got sugar in the blood, tells your cells take it up. Glucagon, if the sugar levels are dropping, tells your liver, we need more sugar, please release some. We also talked about insulin and its role in diabetes already in lab. So that's the pancreas. That's the pancreas. Again, diabetes type 1, diabetes mellitus type 1 is like, again, autoimmune. If your immune system attacks these cells in the pancreatic islets of Langerhans, you're not going to make the insulin to control your glucose levels and you're going to be in trouble. Again, which is why it's so critical that your immune system just finds that balance of getting rid of the stuff that shouldn't be there, but not so twitchy that it starts hurting your own cells that should be there. And then the final gland we're going to talk about is the adrenal gland. Sometimes people call it suprarenal, but suprarenal gland. Right, so here's your kidney. And it's sitting on top. So it is not part of the kidney. It just happens to be sitting on top. It has its own blood supply. There are the adrenal arteries that go into it, perched atop the kidney like a perky little hat. There are two parts to it. The inner part we've already talked about. And medulla just means marrow, the inner part. Adrenal medulla, that's the part that makes adrenaline or epinephrine. That's being controlled by the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So we have already kind of gone over the adrenal medulla. But the outer part, which is more classic glandular tissue, that is the part we need to go over now. There are 3 layers. The outer layer makes, and all of these are steroid hormones, I should say. The outer ones makes hormones as a class. They're called mineralocorticoids. But honestly, the only one I even know that, and the one that is the main player of the outer adrenal cortex mineralocorticoids, is the one you already know, which is aldosterone. And what does aldosterone do?
Pump sodium out of the collecting duct in the kidney.
Yeah, exactly. It basically reclaims sodium out of the collecting duct and puts it back in the body. So it's part of your mineral balance. That's why it's called mineralocorticoid. It's mineral controlling hormone from the cortex of the adrenal gland. Mineralocorticoid, aldosterone. Your friend from, again, from the renin-angiotensin mechanism and from renal physiology. The middle layer makes what are called glucocorticoids. Again, there's like one main hormone here that people usually discuss, even though we say there's like a family. The main one people talk about is cortisol. This is often known as like your stress hormone. It's also called hydrocortisone. Hydrocortisone is the same thing as cortisol. This is released typically in response to stress, and it kind of shifts your body's functioning to deal with stressors. It is called a glucocorticoid because it increases energy production. It gets more glucose available so you can move or run or do whatever you need to do to deal with stressors. It also inhibits kind of more long-term repair. When you have high levels of stress hormones, you have a lot of energy available, but you're suppressing your immune system. Like, who needs to worry about the immune system if we're about to get eaten by a lion? It suppresses long-term like connective tissue maintenance. Who needs to like kind of clean up the shop and make, kind of do long-term maintenance if we're about to get eaten by a lion, right? So the problem is it's really good for dealing with stressors, but if it stays elevated all the time, it actually can be responsible for more degenerative diseases where you're not taking care of kind of long-term maintenance, or you're continually suppressing maintenance or immune activities and things like that. So having the right amount of stress when it's appropriate is good, but also being able to kind of not stay there all the time. Like, being stressed all the time isn't just kind of uncomfortable. It's actually bad for you, your health. So other things I can talk about cortisol. I will mention this. Yeah, some of the studies that have looked at this, I think, are useful just for like kind of making life choices or thinking. So things that can affect levels of cortisol are like predictions over, like stressors will trigger cortisol, but if you have more of a prediction over stressors, you have less cortisol, right? Like they take rats and you have some rat and there's rat over here, there's a rat over here and another cage. And both of them have kind of this electrified grate that they're standing on. Except this one has like a little timer and it knows like every hour the grate gets electrified and it's like, zzz. This one is just random. Every once in a while, zzz, never knows when the next shock's going to come. Even if they get the same number of shocks, the one where he never quite knows when the next shock's coming, his cortisols are way high. The one that's getting the same number of shocks, but it's like, okay, I'm ready for it. Here it comes. He has much lower cortisol levels. So this idea of just having, it's not necessarily just the stressor, but kind of the context of the stressor can make a difference. So kind of creating some control over your life, the stressors in your life can help you. And I should mention, like, the stressors aren't just physical things like shocks. They've shown, like, if you take a little mouse and you whoa.
Oh, sorry.
And you put them like in a little protective cage, but in a colony of other mice that from another colony, and they're like, we hate you, we don't like you, what are you doing here? Even if they can't physically hurt him, just that social stress, sends his cortisol through the roof. So, it's both, it's different kinds of things can cause stress. There's a guy, Robert Sapolsky, that's worth checking out if you have time. Sapolsky, he's a Stanford endocrinologist. One of his first famous book was like Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. But he's really one is he's really entertaining, but one he talks about a lot of really, I think, worthwhile things to think about how we are in our societies and how our endocrine systems are activated. And his Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers is kind of coming from like a zebra is getting chased by a lion and it's either gonna get killed or it's gonna escape and survive. And if it survives, it'll shake it off and go back and eat some grass or whatever. Whereas a human, it's like, oh my God, that lion, I can't believe I'm alive, but I just can't see him. He's coming at me in the face. Oh my God. And did I tell you about this lion? Oh my God. So it's like we tend to keep these stressors kind of reliving. And also, we also have stressors that are chronic. Like, am I going to get into nursing school? And if I get in nursing school, is there even going to be a job waiting for me? And if there is a job waiting for me, what about my relationship? Oh my God. Right. So trying to figure out how to keep cortisol low in general is a good thing, because like I said, this kind of suppresses long-term kind of maintenance. It also keeps your nervous system kind of more like in a good speedy place if you're trying to like deal with something, but in a bad thing because you're going to burn out if you're constantly running things too fast. Cortisol is, or these glucocorticoids related things are used often to suppress inflammation. Like I said, it's suppressing your immune system as part of this suppressing maintenance. A big part of your immune system's inflammation. So if you have a lot of inflammation, you'll get like prednisone. If you got horrible poison oak, you can take prednisone, and that prednisone is basically one of these related drugs or hormones that suppresses inflammation, and it can be a lifesaver. But you just don't want to do it constantly, because then you are actually suppressing maintenance. You're going to start having your connective tissue falling apart and stuff. Same thing, your knee is all swollen. You might get a shot of cortisone. It will suppress the inflammation, but again, it's not such a great thing to have as a chronic kind of thing. Some of the people who have asthma, the inhalers are also steroids to kind of suppress inflammation in the respiratory passages. And some of those are actually really clever. Some of the steroids that they use for asthma are bound onto these large molecules that get stuck in the mucus lining the respiratory passages, but are too big to actually cross the epithelium and get into your body. So they stay localized in your respiratory passage instead of getting into your body, where they're going to cause more of these kind of long-term maintenance suppression stuff. So there's tricks you can play to try to deal with glucocorticoids as drugs. The other thing I should mention, just because it's particularly, I mean, especially living in Marin, most people have probably gotten horrible poison oak and taken prednisone to like not scratch your skin off. Like I can say it can be a lifesaver. But what happens if you are prescribed prednisone? How is it different from a lot of other drugs that you're prescribed? Anybody been prescribed prednisone and noticed something fascinating about it? No?
Do you mean how you like the dosage like slowly increases and then, or is it decrease? I don't remember.
It decreases. You have to taper the dosage. You don't just take it and finish your course and then stop. You have to taper. You you're taking like 10 little pills, then you're taking 8 little pills, then you're taking 6 little pills, then you're taking 4 little pills, then 2 little pills, and finally you stop. You don't just stop it cold turkey, because it can run into trouble, and it has to do with these feedback loops and with the control from the pituitary again. So I'm kind of bringing this in just to kind of remind you all, there's the pituitary. And what is the pituitary releasing to control the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex?
Steroid hormone?
It's going to be adrenocorticotropic hormone, because we're talking about the adrenal gland here. So the pituitary has its tropic hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which talks to the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex then releases cortisol. And then the cortisol, again, like I showed with the thyroid hormone, has an inhibitory effect. If we've got enough cortisol, the pituitary doesn't have to keep releasing this because we got enough. So what happens if you take prednisone as an exogenous drug? Basically, your glucocorticoid levels are really high. So we are saying we got a lot, so the pituitary stops this because there's no reason to put the gas on the adrenal cortex if we've got so much of this stuff already. But without some minimal amount of this ACTH going, the adrenal cortex, the cells will start to atrophy, and they basically start kind of turning off because we know no message to be making this stuff. So at some point, if you just go cold turkey and just stop your cortisol, and the levels in your body just drop to nothing, the pituitary says, oh my God, there's none of this glucocorticoid. We now have to send the ACTH. But these cells have kind of gone into this standby mode and they can't turn back on right away. And you end up getting this crash where your body desperately needs this some level of these glucocorticoids and it's crashed out. So when you taper your prednisone, the levels of the glucocorticoid in your body slowly go down. The pituitary notices that the levels are dropping. ACTH starts coming on, slowly starts waking up the adrenal gland. And by the time you're off the drug totally, the adrenal gland has come out of standby mode and is now functioning back to normal. But yeah, you have to be careful if you're prescribed these glucocorticoids as a therapeutic drug. It's very different in how you stop them because you can run into big problems with this issue with the adrenals shutting down. Okay. I kind of.
Do you know if there's a reason why steroids are like primarily prescribed as like topicals? Is it just for
Say it again?
like why steroids are usually prescribed as like topicals? I've seen them a lot. Is it the way that like, I don't know.
Yeah, it depends what the indication is. If it's a skin condition, it would be topical. But if it's, inflammation in the knee, they inject it in your knee. If you have poison oak, you take the pills and just get it systemically. So the topical is going to be if you're trying to deal with inflammation in your skin. So I mentioned there's an inner layer. The inner layer makes sex hormones. They do play some role. Before you go through puberty, this is one of the main places your body is getting some minimal amounts of sex hormones. So it's, we're going to talk about the gonads in more detail next class, but the gonads aren't the only things that make testosterone and estrogen and stuff like that. And men and women aren't purely testosterone or estrogen. I mean, your mixes of them, it's kind of more predominant one versus the other. Like testosterone is in both men and women as the main driver of libido, like sex drive. Like sex drive is correlated in both men and women with testosterone levels. So your inner layer of the adrenal cortex is making some sex hormones, which can, in particular, if there's a tumor of your adrenal gland, that can cause like huge levels of sex hormones that be like a hypersecretion. So it comes up sometimes in adrenal tumors where you start making way too much of a particular sex hormone because that's one of the things those cells can make. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. So
I have a question. You didn't go over the inner layer of this adrenal gland or adrenal cortex. I apologize.
It's kind of hard to see. That's the part I'm saying is making the sex hormones.
Okay, I thought you were saying the cortisol makes the sex hormone.
What? No, cortisol is a hormone. Cortisol is the stress hormone, the glucocorticoid that does all that stuff we've been talking about. Right, cortisol is made by the middle layer. The inner layer makes the sex hormones. So outer layer makes aldosterone, middle layer makes cortisol, aka hydrocortisone, and inner layer makes sex hormones. And then the medulla, this little place in the inner part, is the part that makes epinephrine or adrenaline, triggered by the sympathetic nervous system. Cool. So any other questions?
You said earlier that we might get to the liver today as kind of a remainder from the digestive system.
So yeah, maybe I should just do it since we'll do it. This is going to just be the liver. We could spend so much. We've already mentioned it a bunch, so I'm just going to take a lot of the stuff we've already talked about the liver, put it in one place, add in a few more things, and then leave it there. And as you go through your life or your studies, you're going to learn more and more about the liver and its role in things. But let's just liver. What kind of things have we already said that the liver does? First, the liver is huge. It's like, it's up in your top of your abdominal cavity. It's literally as big as a loaf of bread. It's really big. What kind of things have we already said the liver is doing?
Stores glycogen.
Yeah, so it stores, I'd say be more general, stores nutrients like glycogen. The cells are filled with glycogen, animal starch, so you have stores of carbohydrates if you need to release it, but other kinds of nutrients as well. Stores vitamins. The liver gets like a first pass off the food coming from your digestive tract, so you can kind of pick through stuff and store things away that you need. So it stores nutrients, which it can then deliver later when you need them. Even more than that, it can interconvert nutrients. Remember how we talked about there's essential amino acids, but there's a bunch of non-essential amino acids, which means you need metabolic pathways that can take one amino acid and turn it into another one. And so the liver has that ability to take things and transform them and make the stuff you need from the other stuff it's already got. So it's kind of this cool thing that way.
Doesn't the liver also process alcohol and drugs?
Yeah, so it does. So, yeah. So it has all these, you're going to, again, when you get more into pharmacology and things later on, you're going to learn about these enzyme systems in the liver that are the primary way your body breaks things down. Like you take your shot of tequila, you don't stay drunk forever because you got enzymes in the liver that are breaking it apart and eventually deactivating it. You have all sorts of enzymes in the liver. Again, we're not going to go into, but it's a major role it plays. Again, you're going to talk about these when you get into your further classes. All these enzyme systems in the liver that are part, like when you look at drug metabolism, they'll talk about, oh, it's metabolized like P blah, blah, blah from the liver. So detoxifies.
Would cleaning up red blood cells, old or dead red blood cells, count as detoxification?
No, that's going to be another one, filtering the blood. So detoxifying is using enzymes to break stuff apart, deactivate things. The filtering the blood is literally going in with big macrophages and eating things and taking them out. Those Kupffer cells are called the big fixed macrophages that are sitting in the liver that actually reach into the blood going through the sinusoids and can, where you pick out worn out red blood cells or whatever else is in there that they need to deal with. So filtering the
What are
blood.
they called again?
Oh,
The macrophages in the liver?
Kupffer cells is the fancy name for the fixed macrophages in the liver.
Thank you.
We also talked about the liver makes plasma proteins. Where's that fibrinogen and all the clotting proteins and all of the complement proteins and all the albumin and all of the alpha globulins and beta globulins, pretty much all the plasma proteins except for the plant antibodies. Who makes antibodies?
Your immune system?
And what particular cells of your immune system?
Memory cells?
Your B cells?
T lymphocytes.
I thought it was T cells. Is it B cells or T cells?
Which one deals with antibody-mediated immunity?
B lymphocytes.
The B lymphocytes are antibodies, so it's got to be a type of B cell. And then what particular type of B cell is the one that's specifically responsible to manufacture antibodies? They have a name, which I promise you should know for your exam in a week from today. They're called plasma cells. Remember, the plasma cells are the cells, the B cells that are created during that clonal selection that become the antibody factories that make the antibodies. So as you can see, the liver does all sorts of stuff. And this detoxifying, again, you're going to learn about very specific enzymatic pathways that are going to be specific for breaking down different kinds of things as you get further into pharmacology and stuff. But for right now, just think about it this way. You can overwhelm the ability of the liver to do this, in alcoholism, right? If you drink a couple of tequila shots, like you break it down and it's all cool. If you're chronically keeping levels of things up and you overwhelm the liver's ability to deal with stuff, you can keep having levels of toxins that actually start taking out your liver cells. And in general, the liver is highly, highly regenerative. Right? You can take out half of your liver and it'll grow back fully functional. You could take out 3/4 of your liver, it'll likely grow back fully functional. Again, for liver transplants, basically you cut your liver in half, you give half to the recipient, and both of you end up regrowing a full liver. It's pretty amazing that way. But it is vulnerable to kind of just chronic poisoning, like in alcoholism, where you eventually, like cirrhosis of the liver is where you eventually replace the functional liver tissue with scar tissue and fat. So then that is not so good. But if you if you have like some acute liver damage, if you survive past the acute problem, then, I had, like I mentioned, I had hepatitis A when I was in grad school and my liver was trashed. And it was like about a year before enzyme levels were all back to where I could just go out and just not think about drinking a beer at a show or something. But at this point, I don't think about it at all anymore. It's just like my liver never had a problem. So yeah, the liver is kind of crazy amazing that way. Okay. So, yeah, so liver, super important. You can't live without your liver, as opposed to you can live without a spleen or something. The liver is an essential organ, even though it looks so kind of nondescript. And it's harder to say what it does. You know, if people talk about it being a gland, oh, it makes bile. Duh. It makes bile. It's an essential gland for your digestive processes to break down fats and stuff. So, you know, it does so much stuff. It's hard to put it in a system, right? You know, the heart, the circulatory system, your lungs are in the respiratory system for the most part, but the liver is just like got its little cells and all sorts of things. So la la la.